Chapter 1, Preparation. The eclipse of the sun, which you have asked me to describe, occurred on Monday, the 16th of June, 1806. Its greatest depth of shadow fell on the American continent somewhere around the angle of 42 degrees from the equator. I was on a trip to visit my parents who still lived in our family home, located in the high country of Otsego. It was in that part of the country where the eclipse was most impressive. My memories of the great event and the events of the day are as sharp as if they had happened yesterday. Lake Otsego, where the Susquehanna River starts, lies as close as possible to where the shadow of the eclipse would fall. The village, which has been the home of my family for many years, is placed in a beautiful position at the foot of the lake. It lies in a valley between two mountain ranges that are almost the same height. The clear Susquehanna River flows quickly from the southern shore of the lake. It is crossed by a high wooden bridge. The bridge divides the main street of the little town from the gardens and fields on the eastern bank of the river. Here was everything that could be desired from nature. There was a lake, river, mountains, trees, and homes of the people. All these features showed the full effect of the varied movement of light and shadow through that impressive day. Throughout the area of country to be darkened by the eclipse, the whole population was in a state of nervous excitement for weeks before the event. On the evening of the 16th of June, our family could not think or talk about anything else. My father was still alive then, and my 4 brothers were at home. To kill time, we walked up and down the wide hall of the house, or sat at the family dining table. As it can be imagined, our conversations were entirely about the movements of planets, stars, and eclipses. We were all enjoying the feeling that we would experience a grand and extraordinary sight, probably a sight which millions of other people would never see. It might have been selfish to think that we were to have more luck than other people. I think our interest in science, however, stopped us from being entirely selfish about the coming event. There were many guesses about the weather as the evening approached. Everyone had a different opinion about this important subject. A passing cloud might hide the full view from us, or rain could spoil the special moment of the eclipse. I was more confident about the weather than my neighbors. We were one of the very free families in the state at that time to have an instrument for measuring air pressure. This instrument was carefully consulted all through the day, and each reading indicated dry weather. We were relieved to see so many stars in the sky that night before going to bed. The first thing we did the next morning was to open the window and again examine every inch of the sky. I got out of bed early and found the sky calm and with no sign of clouds. The day had arrived, but the shadows of the night still hung over the valley. For a moment, I looked at the familiar view, the clear lake with its beautiful setting among the farms and green forests. I saw the peaceful bay, surrounded by the hills where I had climbed every rock and cave many times when I was a young boy. It was as dear to me as the face of a friend. It seemed that the summer landscape had taken on a special quality. It had never looked so beautiful, even though the shadows of a major eclipse would cover every tree and every wave within a few hours. There was one object in the landscape which a stranger would probably not have noticed or might even have called ugly. It was a familiar sight to everyone in the village. It was a tall, grey, dead tree without branches and was known by the local people as an ancient and rough guide to the east. It had been standing on the top of the eastern hill since people first started living in the village. It still stood straight, even though it had been blown about by many storms. When I was a child, I pretended it was a flagpole. Perhaps it was a symbol of freedom for the country people of an earlier generation. Now, as a young man and a sailor, I looked at the familiar branches of the tall tree with its unusual shades of silver and grey. It became for me the sail of a ghost ship. I remember greeting it with a smile, as it was the first thing I had recognized in the old forest since I had returned home. Suddenly I saw an object that was far more interesting. I discovered a star, a single star, shining faintly in, which had now changed to a pale grey half-light. Bright touches of pink were beginning to show in the eastern sky. There were no clouds to be seen, not even the smallest shadow. I was very interested in that lonely star and continued looking out the window in a sort of dream. I knew that stars were part of the planetary system. However, what did I actually know about planets such as the sun and the moon? My brain was confusing itself with forgotten ideas of size and distance. What was the time required by light to enter the dark space that lay between heaven and earth? I also wondered if there were people who lived on planets with feelings and ideas like my own. Soon, the sun came into view. I noticed an orange light glowing among the branches of the trees on the eastern mountain. I watched the colors increase in the sky and the gradual lighting of the surrounding hills, as I had done 100 times before. The rough outline of the trees, nearly 200 feet in height, showed against the sky on the top of the hills. The golden light of the morning moved silently down the front of the western mountains. It gave clear views of woods and fields until lake, valley, and village all lay smiling in the cheerful glow of the warm sun. Chapter 2. Excitement on the watch. Our family gathered early and was soon joined by friends and relations who were all enthusiastic and excited. Each person was provided with a colored glass for viewing the eclipse. By 9 o'clock, the cool mountain air had gone, and the heat of summer filled the valley. The sky was still clear, and a better day would have been hard to find, even in this good climate. There was not a breath of wind, and we could see the rays of heat over the smooth surface of the lake. There was every sign of a hot and heavy midday. We left the house and walked across the grass into the broad and green street which lay between our gates and the lake. Here there were no branches hanging over the road to block the view. The sky, the trees on the mountains, and the clear sheet of water in front of us were all easily seen. As the time for the eclipse came closer, we tried to remain patient. Our enthusiasm and excitement increased to a high level. The older members of the group were discussing the details of an earlier eclipse. Leaving them to talk about their memories, I walked away, glass in hand, through the main streets of the village. There was hardly a house or a face that I didn't know in the little town. It gave me extra pleasure in this holiday at home to be sharing in the special excitement of the coming eclipse. Everything in the town was still quiet, although things were rather unusual for this time on a summer's day. Many people were busy with their usual jobs. Women and children were carrying buckets of water. People were sweeping their houses. I passed the shops and could hear the hammer of shoes being put on the horses' feet and the sound of wood being cut to size. Teams of horses were carrying goods through the streets, and people were still doing their usual shopping. A farm vehicle with a heavy load of dried grass was crossing the bridge. The sleepy driver was coming in from the field, with no idea of the changes about to take place in the sky above him. Most people, however, were on watch, as someone seemed to be looking out of a window at every house. Groups of people walked along the streets, looking up to the sky and talking with interest and excitement. We heard that there were 1 or 2 people who did not believe that there would be a total eclipse of the sun, simply because they had never seen one. Seeing is believing, we are told, although we could argue that this comment might not be true. None of us could persuade these neighbors of ours who had not seen an eclipse that it really would happen. Here was the importance of using reason and knowledge. These were people with fixed ideas and not willing to change them. I was interested to hear what one of these doubting people had to say about the eclipse, so for a bit of fun, I went looking for someone I knew. When I arrived, he was not at home, having left the village on business. As he had climbed on his horse that morning, he was true to his opinion. He declared to his wife that he was not running away from that eclipse. He then went on to say with honesty that if the eclipse did pass over him during his journey, then he would acknowledge that it was true. This, at least, was very positive. I had just returned to my family, who I had left on watch, when one of my brothers, with very keen sight, called out and said he could see a dark line on the western edge of the sun's disk. Everyone looked up immediately. Through the glasses we could now see a dull but definite object shading the light of the sun. A cry of satisfied delight came from everyone. We were not to be disappointed, as there was no cloud to hide the wonderful sight. A sight almost out of this world in its wonder was about to be revealed to us, too. In a very short time, the round shape of the moon was seen. Another cry of delight followed, as one by one, we could all see the dark, round outline clearly against the golden light of the sun. Gradually, and almost at first, without being noticed, the dark and mysterious shape moved across the sun. We had a feeling of wonder as we watched in silence. So far, there was no noticeable change in the light on the lake and mountains. The familiar scene was its usual bright and glowing picture, as on any other day in June. The people were now pushing into the streets, their usual jobs forgotten for the moment, as they all looked upward. There was such a small change in the strength of the sun that it seemed more like an act of faith rather than a positive sight. Gradually, a fifth and even a quarter of the sun's disk became hidden, but the sun was still too bright for us to watch without the colored glass. With the protection of the glass, we could watch the progress of this rare event. The midday heat became less, and the cool of the early morning returned to the valley. I was looking upward, watching carefully at the first moment where the dark outline of the moon could be seen by the naked eye. A man I knew walked past. "Come with me," he said quietly, at the same moment taking hold of my arm and leading me away. He was a man of few words, and there was an expression on his face which caused me to go with him without a pause. He led me to the courthouse, and from there into a room in another building, occupied by two people. It was the figure looking out the window that caught my attention. It was a man with a tired face and chains around his arms. He was a prisoner under sentence of death, guarded by the man at his side. Chapter 3. Misery and Majesty. A very sad thing happened in our little town recently. The teacher of a small school outside the village era. The child was a little girl, and actually his own niece. It was said that she had been born with a problem which prevented her from saying certain words that the teacher wanted her to say clearly. The teacher did not think the child was making an effort to say the words correctly. He continued to beat her so severely that she never recovered from the effects of the blows and died a week later. The teacher was arrested, tried for murder, found guilty, and a date was set for his death. This was the first time the death sentence had been given in Otsego country. It made a very deep impression on people. Until the beating, the general character of the teacher had been very good in every way. It was beyond all doubt that he was deeply sorry for the crime which he had committed. He had acted from a false idea of physical injury he was causing the child. He was so sorry about what he had done that the public felt great sympathy for him. They had signed requests for a pardon, or at least for a delay in ending his life. These requests had been sent to the governor of the state. The day arrived for his death by hanging, without any word back from the governor. The governor was at his country house, at least 80 miles from Albany. The request had not been sent in until the last minute to allow as many people as possible to sign the paper, and no one had calculated the time it would take to travel the 80 miles. No letter was received back, and it looked as if the death sentence would be carried out. The day arrived, and crowds of people from nearby towns poured into the village. They had come to watch the awful and still unknown sight of a public hanging. As I had looked down on the main street of the village that day, it had seemed to me that the street was a sea of human faces. The clock struck 12, and the prisoner was taken from the jail. He was seated, as is usual, on the box in which he was to be buried. He was carried to the place of hanging, sitting between two men from the church. His look of absolute misery was difficult to describe. I have seen other criminals hanged for their crimes, but I have never seen such an expression as the one that appeared on the face of this miserable man. When he saw the circle of rope, he stood up and turned his back on the awful object, squeezing his chained hands in horror. The priests from the church eventually managed to calm him down, and the last prayer was offered. The prisoner's own sincere response had just been spoken when a letter from the governor made a late arrival. A short pardon had been granted, so the prisoner was carried back to the miserable cell from where he had come in the morning. This is how the unhappy man, who had been brought from the prison, was able to see the wonderful eclipse. During the previous year, he had only seen the sun once, as the prisons of that time were underground and dark. I will never forget that miserable figure. I can picture him now, standing at the window, pale and thin from being locked up for a year. His cheeks were marked by the constant crying, and his whole body was worn by shame and deep regret for what he had done. Here was the contrast of a man at the lowest stage of his life about to see the highest and most wonderful display of nature that could be revealed to the human race. The unhappy murderer seemed to stare upward at the extraordinary sight of the eclipse. It was as if he were recording a mental picture. He appeared to be overcome with feelings almost as painful as death, and could see the world beyond the grave. In his miserable stare, he stood as still as a statue, with his chained arms lifted up to the sky. It would have been impossible to plan such a good human lesson as this. On one hand, there was the wonderful movement of the sun and the moon, and on the other, a picture of miserable human shame and regret. It was an incident to remember forever, and the lesson was not lost on me. When I left the courthouse, the country appeared to be an unusual dull yellow. A great change had taken place. The trees on the distant mountains were covered by the shadow from the strange sky and were no longer green. The lake had a bright look, which was very odd. All the animals were in a state of anxiety. The birds were flying about in great excitement, not sure of what to do, as it didn't appear to be the normal approach of evening. Even the dogs became worried and stood closer to their owners. The expression of the people who had looked enthusiastic and interested earlier in the morning now changed. Some looked anxious or thoughtful. Others wore an expression of wonder according to their individual characters. Now everyone came out of their house. Every second, it became darker and darker, and the children came running to their mothers in fright. The women themselves were looking about for their husbands. Most of the men were silent and serious, and as the darkness increased, many left their jobs to be near their wives and children. Once again I stood beside my father and my brothers at the gates of our home. The sun lay at an angle to the south and east, in the best possible position for observation. I remember that I searched the whole grey sky for a cloud, but could not see a single one. It was one of those absolutely clear days, less rare in America than in Europe. The steadily failing light and the gradual approach of darkness became all the more impressive as there was not a cloud in the sky. The birds, which a short time ago had been flying about in great excitement, now seemed convinced that night had arrived. It was possible to see swallows flying down under the roofs of the houses. Pigeons flew home to their cages, and other little birds returned to their boxes. Through the open door of a small stable, we saw the chickens settling in for the night. The usual strength of the sun had now become much weaker, so we could look upward for a long time, without hurting our eyes. The sun appeared like a 3- or 4-day-old moon, but with a larger and more brilliant curve. Looking to the west for a moment, a flash appeared in front of my eyes. For a second I thought I had imagined it, but soon after I could clearly see that it was a star. One after another, they came into view more rapidly than in the evening light. Altogether, about 50 stars appeared in a broad, dark area of the sky over the trees on the western mountain. This wonderful sight of the stars during the middle of the day was an exciting experience. Suddenly, one of my brothers shouted, "The moon!" I looked quickly toward the east again, and there was the moon, so clear in the sky that it was almost frightening. The round shape, the beauty, the whole appearance and content of the planet were as clearly seen as we had ever seen them before or have seen them since. The moon looked huge, dark, powerful, and majestic. It demonstrated this by its power to completely block out the rays of the sun. We may be adults, but at heart, we are still children. We judge objects in daily life by what we see. We usually think of the sun and the moon as sources of magic, light and delicate, in nature. We saw the material nature of the moon so clearly that it changed all our previous ideas about the planet. The moon was not just a cloud or false shadow. It was a huge mass of material substance that separated the sun above us from the earth where we stood. The darkness of early night now covered the village. Chapter 4. Black Minutes. My thoughts turned to the sea, as I was a sailor at heart. I had a mental picture of what the eclipse would be like over the ocean. I could imagine the beauty and magic of the darkness falling over the bright water in the middle of the day. It would be hard to imagine a more majestic sight than the changes of light and shade over the waves during the eclipse. My mind was busy with thoughts of beautiful, with white sails, and other ships of all shapes and sizes, sliding like spirits across the dark waves. I was brought out of my dreaming by a familiar and ordinary incident. I heard the dull step of animal feet on the village bridge. A few cows, thinking that it was already night, were coming home from the open fields outside the town. It is not surprising these gentle animals were deceived, as it had become much darker than the half-light of evening when they usually returned. The air was becoming very damp, even more so than the previous evening. It was so cold that there must have been a big drop in temperature since the heat of the morning. The lake, the hills, and the houses of the little town could not be seen in the darkness. The absence of the usual lights in the homes made the darkness even more impressive. All work had stopped, and the only sound that could be heard was the whispering voices of the people. "Listen! Hear that bird?" asked a friend standing near me. As we listened in absolute silence, we heard the clear, sad note of the lonely bird of night. The sound was slowly repeated at intervals from the eastern bank of the river. The song of the summer birds, usually so loud in June, had entirely stopped for the last half hour. A night bat came flying above our heads. Many stars could now be seen, although there were not enough of them to alter the darkness. There was only one point in the far distant northern sky that the light of day appeared to remain. At 12 minutes past 11, the moon was most clearly seen. It appeared as a huge black circle, so nearly hiding the sun that no light at all shone through from that usually bright star. Behind the sun was a ring of light rays. The darkness of night had fallen. A quiet excitement and interest was felt by everyone. People seem to show more respect than usual for nature when they stare at all the wonders in the sky. They admire the peaceful colors after rain, the heavy clouds of a big storm, the bright flash of electricity, the falling star, and the beautiful arrangement of the northern lights. These treasures never fail to give people a feeling of wonder, something greater than looking at any of the sights on Earth. There is a sense of interest and expectation connected with all the changing activity in the skies. It is a sense of wonder which may be traced to the repeated words of the great religious forecasts. Perhaps they are whispering to our spirits and giving our physical sight a sense of mystery. I look back now to that impressive hour when I stood as a young man with my family and friends. As we shared the same sense of deep wonder, I have been so sure that there is a presence greater than all of us. It was a good lesson for me. I realized I was just a very tiny part of the whole pattern of heaven and earth. I often think back to the day of the eclipse. That movement of the moon across the sun and the darkness at midday is as fresh in my mind as if it had happened yesterday. A group of silent, dark figures had gathered nearby, all of us feeling the same emotion. My father stood very still, only 15 feet away from me, but I could not see his face. 3 minutes of almost total darkness passed. The minutes felt longer because of the strong thoughts and feelings that filled our minds. The feelings created by this majestic sight had been ones of wonder and respect. It seemed as if the great Father of the universe had deliberately covered his face in anger. As awful as the darkness had been, the return of the light from the sun was just the opposite. The ring of light above the moon became suddenly brighter, and the sky behind the moon could again be seen. The stars disappeared, and light began to show along the tops of the distant mountains. And then a flood of light from the sun covered the whole valley. It was with a strength that would be hard to describe if you had not actually felt it yourself. There is no way I can compare the joy in the return of the sun after the eclipse to anything else I know. The only thing the eclipse could perhaps be compared to was the passage of a dark cloud across the sun. However, the eclipse was 1,000 times more effective. It seemed to have a spiritual quality, offering protection, hope, and pleasure in all the elements of the earth. It was not at all like the early morning or the actual rising of the sun. The change to darkness was not gradual. It was sudden and surprising, as if we were expecting to see a strange presence coming out of the sky. I know it is a silly thought, but to me it seemed that the rays of the sun could actually be seen flowing out through the darkness. They came from the darkness to light up the forest, the mountains, the valley, and the lake with their glowing touch. There was another majestic movement as the curve of the sun appeared again, and the moon could be seen moving on her path through the gap. Venus, the morning and evening star, was still shining as brightly as ever. To the naked eyes, this second passage of the moon only remained for a moment. As it finished, I looked again at the scene around me. The street could now be seen and was filled with people from the village. Along the edge of the road that ran from the village, along the edge of the road that ran from the valley to the side of the mountain were 20 coaches carrying travelers. Behind them were teams of workers from the hills. They had all stopped on the road exactly where they were, out of an unconscious respect for the eclipse as much as by a curious interest. Every face was turned toward the sky, and every eye took in the wonder of the sight. Men and women stood nearby me in the open street, with tears running down their faces. The sound of crying could be heard coming from every direction. Even the educated and thoughtful people continued standing in silence. It was several minutes before anyone was able to speak. At such a time, how could man deny the existence of a powerful presence? After the eclipse, I remember noticing the moment when I could see the grass on which I was standing. Later again, I watched the shadow of the leaves on the stone path. The white flowers in my mother's garden were the first objects seen by the family members who were looking out the windows of our house. Every man and woman was soon delighting again in the welcome return of light after that awful moment of midday darkness. People who see any extraordinary sight together usually enjoy sharing their impressions about it afterward. I do not remember one single person to have ever spoken about his or her feelings at the time of the eclipse. It would seem as if everyone's feelings were too personal to be discussed in a light or easy way. I have lived a varied and interesting life and have met all sorts of people in my travels around the world. I have been lucky enough to see many events on land, in the sky, and on the ocean, but I can only say that I have never seen such a wonderful sight as the total eclipse of the sun. There could not have been a better lesson to remind me of how minor and ordinary we are compared to the wonders and majesty of nature.